All right, let's get right into it. When we see these absolutely devastating floods on the news, what's the one word we always hear? Unprecedented. But what if that's not the real story? What if these disasters aren't so much a surprise from Mother Nature, but a totally predictable failure of our own systems?
I mean, just look at this. It's a scene that's become heartbreakingly familiar, right? We're told these are unforeseeable acts of God. But the research we're digging into today asks a much tougher question. When the warnings have been there for years, sometimes even decades, is a catastrophe like this really unprecedented? Or is it something closer to unforgivable?
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. If the experts, the scientists, and even the government's own reports can see these disasters barreling towards us, why do we, as a society, just consistently fail to get ready for them? Well, here's the crucial thing to understand. The problem isn't a lack of information. The source material for this whole explainer is crystal clear on this. The warnings are almost always there. The real culprits? They're these complex, often kind of invisible human, political, and social forces that just stop us from acting on what we already know. To really see what this looks like in the real world, let's start with our first case study, Hurricane Katrina. It's a tragic example for sure, but it's also a perfect blueprint for how these systemic failures play out. Now, to get our heads around Katrina, there's a key term you've got to know: policy surprise. It's that jaw-dropping moment for policymakers after a disaster hits when they suddenly realize that their whole understanding of a threat they thought they knew inside and out, was completely catastrophically wrong. And that policy surprise usually triggers a full-blown policy failure. It's kind of got three main ingredients. First, the event completely shatters what the people in charge thought could happen. Second, from their perspective, it feels like there was no warning, even if, in reality, the warnings were everywhere. And third, the disaster just brutally exposes how totally unprepared everyone actually was. Okay, so what's so fascinating here is you can see the lead up to that failure. Before 2001, America's emergency agency, FEMA, was all about natural disasters. That was their whole jam. But after 9/11, of course, the entire national focus shifted. By 2003, FEMA got swallowed up by this huge new Department of Homeland Security. And just 2 years later, Katrina hit. And this quote from the guy who was running FEMA at the time, well, it says everything. The new top priority was terrorism. Natural disasters, they became the neglected stepchild. That meant the funding, the experts, the focus. It was all being pulled away from getting ready for things like monster hurricanes. So you'd think we'd all learn from that, right? Well, let's fast forward a bit and jump across the globe to Australia, where recent events have felt like a terrifying echo of the exact same mistakes. And whoa, I mean, this slide just lays it out plain as day. Look at this parallel. In 2003, the U.S. folds its emergency management agency into a new security-focused department. Then, boom, in 2017, Australia does almost the exact same thing, absorbing its emergency management into a new security-focused department. It's almost a carbon copy. You know that old saying, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes? Well, this is a perfect example. The very same structural changes that made the U.S. so vulnerable before Katrina were basically mirrored in Australia more than a decade later. And the result was predictable. Just like in the U.S., the national conversation in Australia, and more importantly, the government's money and attention, it all pivoted hard towards security, terrorism, and law enforcement. And that boring, predictable, but deadly threat of flooding? Once again, it got pushed to the back burner. So we've seen the political train wrecks, the bureaucratic mess, but to really get why this pattern keeps happening over and over, we've got to go deeper. We have to talk about the psychology of how our brains even think about risk. This is so fascinating. This chart basically shows that our feelings are just awful at math. We are hardwired to freak out about what experts call dread risk. You know, things that are spectacular, catastrophic, and feel totally out of our control. Look over on the right. Terrorism, nuclear war, that's the stuff that grabs headlines and our imagination. But now look to the left. The mundane stuff, car travel, home appliances. Statistically, these are way more likely to harm us, but they don't give us that same jolt of fear. And that's the trap. A predictable disaster, like a flood, often falls into that less dreaded category, even though it's highly probable, which makes it incredibly hard to get people to take it seriously beforehand. So this psychological quirk then bleeds into how governments make policy.
What you're looking at here are the invisible battles that are constantly being fought behind the scenes. For every big decision, there's this tug of war between different ways of even thinking about a problem. Should we try to anticipate and prevent every failure? Or should we just accept that failures will happen and focus on being resilient, on bouncing back? These aren't just abstract ideas. They're huge fights over money, resources, and what gets prioritized.
Just think about it with flood defenses. One group is arguing we need a no-fault approach so we can learn when a levee fails, while another group wants to assign blame to the engineers. One side says trust the handful of experts, another wants to get input from the whole community. And while they're all debating and fighting, the water just keeps rising. This endless tug of war between perfectly valid ideas often leads to the worst possible outcome: total paralysis and doing nothing at all. Okay, so given all these deep-seated problems in our politics, in our bureaucracy, even in our own heads, where does that leave us? Well, the first step is actually pretty simple. We have to start asking better questions when disaster strikes. And if you take one thing away from this entire explainer, please let it be this. The failure is almost never about a lack of information. It is a failure of action. We know the risks. The data is there. The real challenge is closing that huge gap between knowing something and actually doing something about it.
So the next time you see a disaster unfolding on the news, you've got a new toolkit. Don't just ask, what happened? Ask these 3 critical questions instead. 1. What did we actually know about this risk beforehand? 2. How was that risk communicated, and who was it communicated to? And 3, this is the most important one. What was the response to that communication? Did anyone listen? Did anyone act?
Because this is the cycle we seem to be trapped in. From Hurricane Katrina all the way to the recent floods in Australia, the story is just hauntingly similar. The risks were known. The warnings were given. The question that we're all left with is a tough one. Will the response ever truly change?